you very
Thank you.
much. All right, we will now move to item 12.2, 2024-25 second interim report. Mr. Hacker?
Good evening. As uh, as we've been told before, sometimes it's hard to read this presentation, so we're getting into the habit of putting this QR code up. And if you want to, you can scan that and look at the presentation on your device. And while you're doing that, I just want to take this opportunity to thank some of the team members that have participated in the second interim process. We'll be getting to the presentation shortly, but this is a good opportunity. And I'm just going to thank them by first name. Well, first of all, I want to thank Jennifer Cisneros, who is here, who has stepped into a very important leadership role within business services. We've had quite a few vacancies, and it has been rough going. And Jennifer, her leadership has been just absolutely incredible in bringing the teams together. Everyone else on the budget team that I want to thank, and we'll thank other departments in future presentations, but on the budget team, I want to thank Gloria, Laura, Stephanie, Maritza, Rocio, Joshua, Jules, Stacy, Nancy, Patrick, and Erica. I, I cannot even begin to tell you how busy this team has been. We are second interim. We just finished federal program monitoring and at the same time trying to implement Business Plus, the new system that OCD is putting in. And the work that this team has had to do has just been incredible, and I'm just so proud and grateful for them. All right. All that being said, we're going to get into the presentation. Good evening, President Bustos, members of the board, Superintendent Almendarez, and our educational partners across the district. We are here tonight for the second interim presentation. This is the third presentation over the last few meetings covering all aspects of the second interim. So what we did about a month ago, we started to look at enrollment and ADA, and we started to look also at everything that we're doing regarding reducing the structural deficit. And we did all of that work to set the framework for tonight's presentation, which is the actual second interim, which is going to be mostly a focus on the actual finances. And I'll every once in a while look back to what we covered over the last few meetings, and of course we can go back to that if you have questions. But the focus tonight really is going to be on the second interim finances. And you've seen this diagram many times. This is our budget timeline, and as I always point out, the budget team is working on multiple fiscal years at once. And where we're at right now is second interim, middle of March. That covers the second interim period from the beginning of the fiscal year all the way to the end of January. So what we do is we take a snapshot of our financials as of the end of January and use that information to form projections on what the year is going to look like. For interims, for both first interim and second interim, there are three possible certifications. One is positive, which is a certification that the district will absolutely be able to meet its financial obligations for the current year and the next 2 years. Then we have a qualified certification where the district may not be able to meet its financial obligations, and this is most commonly used when a district is able to meet the obligations in the current year, but not necessarily in the out years of the multi-year projection. And then we have a negative certification where it says the district will be unable to meet its financial obligations. And this is most commonly used when a district is not even able to meet its obligation in the current year. And I am happy to report that we are going to submit to OCDE a second interim report with positive certification. All that being said, let's jump into the finances, and we're going to start with the ending fund balance, and we'll come back to this at the end of the presentation. So we started off the year at $362.5 million in reserves, and we have a deficit of about $154 million this year, and we will end up the year at about $208.5 million. So that's a $154 million deficit. At first interim, it was 187. So there have been some changes since second interim related to since first interim related to unduplicated pupil count, and that has enhanced our revenue a little bit. So that has worked to improve our finances a little bit. And we'll come back to this toward the end of the presentation. But as I've pointed out in previous presentations, you can't just look at the ending fund balance as one big sum of money. We actually have restricted funds and unrestricted. And in this chart, the blue band on the bottom are the unrestricted funds in our ending fund balance, and the red is the restricted. And what you see as we go through the multi-year projection through that last year of the multi-year, 26-27, you see that the unrestricted part is getting smaller and smaller. And in fact, by 26-27, we are down to 2% required reserves. So that's as low as we can go before we have to do a qualified or negative certification. In taking a look at the official assumptions, and I'll look back a little bit at where we were just a few weeks ago. So there's four aspects, there's four components to our assumptions related to LCFF, Local Control Funding Formula. The first is COLA, and that's not in our control. That is what the state provides us as a cost of living adjustment. Then we have enrollment. So how many students do we have enrolled? The attendance factor of the students that are enrolled, how many of them are attending on a daily basis, and our UPP, or unduplicated pupil percentage, which is what percentage of the enrolled students are either from a low-income household or English language learners or foster youth or McKinney-Vento youth. And I'll go through the assumptions because it's important to talk about all of these. On cost of living adjustment, current year 1.07, that of course doesn't change. The assumption right now for next year is 2.43. That is down from first interim. It was 2.93 at first interim. And then 26-27, we're at 3.52, which is a slight upward tick from first interim. For enrollment, we are projecting a decline in enrollment. And you can see what those numbers are: 35,716 current year, 34,571 next year, 33,130. I want to remind everyone that these are the official assumptions from our demographer. And the demographer is standing by those numbers. We have already done and will continue to do additional analysis, cohort progression analysis, as well as historical trend analysis. We're going to be looking at actual number of students that are enrolled, that are coming into TK and K. We've already done that. The numbers are not promising. So it appears that the difference between what our demographer projected and what we may end up at could be off by anywhere from 500 to 1,000 students. And that's a shocking number, but that's the reality. We're standing by these numbers at second interim because that's the best number that we have at this point in time. Between now and the time that we bring adopted budget to you, we're really going to have to do a deep dive into that and bring you back at adopted budget the most accurate number that we can based on what we know at that time. On attendance factor, we were trending at 95% just about a month and a half ago. Since that time, due to a number of factors related to what's going on the federal scene, our attendance has dropped precipitously. And right now we have an attendance factor. I think I told you a couple weeks ago that it was at 94%. It is now tracking at 93.6%. So that is the assumption that we're putting in right now. Yet we're putting in, I'm going to say optimistic assumptions going into 25-26 of 94.8 and 95.7%. But there's a reason that we're doing that. We're planning for success. We really need to focus on this. The second interim analysis, and I'll allude to this later, has really indicated that on the expenditure side of the books, there are a lot of things that are out of our control. Utilities, insurance, special education, transportation. So we really need to focus on the things that are under our control. And attendance and unduplicated pupil percentage, those are things that are under our control. If we have a focus on attendance and really get that message out and put supports in place to drive attendance, we can achieve these numbers. We could have put lower numbers to be conservative, but that's planning for failure, and we would rather plan for success. On unduplicated pupil percentage, 92.1% this year, with some once again optimistic projections in the out years of 95.96, but these are doable with a concerted effort that is across all departments and in the district, as well as engaging other officials in the county and the city. We can drive these numbers. So that's why we have these percentages. And if we hit all of these numbers, the difference between LCFF at first interim and second interim over the course of the multi-year is $48 million. This is critical. So this is why we need to focus on this, because revenue related to attendance and revenue related to UPP is controllable. In looking at the actual revenue, and the way that this slide is going to work, and you've seen this before, the blue arrow is the trend between adopted budget and first interim, and with that column with the blue header, that same number, and the red arrow is the trend between first interim and second interim. So looking at revenue, LCFF, we're up from first interim by about 2.4%, and that is due to what I just talked about, the increase in the UPP that we were able to get this year. Federal and other state revenue are relatively flat, and other local revenue is up 36.5%, and that is due predominantly to a Medi-Cal reimbursement. And it was Dr. Alvarez who asked, I think, at the last meeting or the meeting before, about these reimbursements, and what I answered him at the time was, these reimbursements are an important part of our revenue, but they're very unpredictable in terms of timeline. We don't know when they're going to hit, so you're never going to see these in our assumptions. We're never going to book this revenue until we actually see the revenue. But right now, we did get that big reimbursement of about it was about $11 million. So the biggest part of that increase was the Medi-Cal reimbursement. Looking at revenue across the multi-year, what you're seeing there is LCFF relatively flat. So even though we've got some optimistic projections, the decline in enrollment counters those. So even though we're driving attendance, and even though we're driving UPP, and even though we have some decent COLAs, the decline in enrollment is countering all of those. So LCFF revenue is relatively flat. You see incremental declines in federal and other state, and on the other local, as you could see, 43.3 million this year, back down to 32.7 over the next 2 years, because we cannot count on those Medi-Cal or SMA or any of those reimbursements. And I always show this slide just to reinforce the fact that LCFF really is the predominant part of our revenue. It is the part that is the most controllable, and it is the part that provides us the most revenue to provide all of the student supports. Looking at the other side of the books, expenditures, starting with salaries and benefits. On certificated, actually on all of these lines, certificate, classified, and employee benefits, very, very little movement since first interim. And at first glance, that you go, how in the world did that happen? And I do want to express that there was a lot of effort that went into this, and I'm confident of these numbers. The budget team did what's called position control analysis, and then I approached it personally from some trend analysis, looking at prior year trends, and then also looking at actuals through the end of January. And we independently came to numbers that were within just fractions of each other. So based on that, we're confident in the salary numbers. Very little movement from first interim. Looking at salaries and benefits over the course of the multi-year, and this is a very important slide. That blue band on the bottom is certificated salaries, and you see that very big drop between the current year and next year, and that is due to both the SERP and the reduction in force, so the Supplemental Early Retirement Plan and the reduction in force, and then going into 26-27, a slight uptick related to step and column. Classified salaries, relatively flat, only step and column. And then on benefits, whenever you have a decrease in salaries, you're going to see a decrease in benefits because a lot of those benefits are statutory, which are tied to salaries. So you see that big decline going into 25, 26. That's associated with the decrease in certificated salaries, and then a slight uptick in 26, 27 due to anticipated increases in medical costs. Looking at supplies, services, and capital, a really big decrease in supplies, and that is due to what we saw in looking at trend analysis, so looking at actuals through the end of January, looking at prior year trends. Also, we're reviewing requisitions and making sure that we're only moving requisitions forward that are absolutely necessary this year. So we did see an almost 20% decrease in supplies since first interim. On services, also a slight downtick. That is due in part to that review, but it is also due to the fact that in the second interim review, we saw quite a few capital projects that were coded to services, and they really should not have been coded to services. You code if you have a repair. So if you're repairing a roof, it is okay to code it to services. But if you're replacing a roof, you don't code it to services. You code it to capital improvements. We saw some of those things that were not coded properly, so we moved them, and that is a big reason why you see that downtick on services. Of course, that did result in an uptick in capital, and that's what you see there, a 22.7% increase in capital. That's due to what I just talked about, as well as some accelerated technology purchases. Our vendors contacted us and said due to the impending tariffs, they could hold prices for a few weeks on Chromebooks and other technology. So we pulled the trigger and went ahead with those purchases in order to avoid the impact of the tariffs. Looking at supply, services, and capital over the multi-year, as I alluded to earlier, that the second interim analysis was critical, and what we saw was on the services in particular, there are quite a few services where we cannot necessarily control. And by way of example, utilities. I mean, we could have some incremental, control over utilities, but at the end of the day, we have a district that needs to operate, and there's going to be lights and HVAC running. So the utilities, that's really not completely under our control. We also have special education, transportation, insurance. There's just a tremendous number of services that we can't control. So because of that, what you're seeing here is a much less exaggerated decrease in services over the multi-year than what we projected at first interim. However, on capital, that is absolutely controllable. We can turn off the spigot and say we are putting a freeze on capital construction projects the rest of this year, next year, even the year after. That is something that we can do on a temporary basis. It's not sustainable over the long term, but in order to control the budget deficit, we could absolutely do that, and that is what's happening here. Looking at expenditures as a whole, and I always show the slide to emphasize the fact that the vast majority of our budget expenditure side really is in salaries and benefits, with certificated salaries accounting for 35% of the budget in blue, and then moving clockwise, classified salaries 14%, management 5%, and benefits, that's both statutory benefits and health and welfare, at 27%, with the rest of the budget accounting for just 19%. Looking at expenditures and revenue as a whole, this is, as you've heard me say almost countless times, this is the story of COVID. You've got the green line as revenue, the purple line is expenditure. Revenue is outpacing expenditures throughout the pandemic as the federal and state government threw lots of money our way, more than $400 million. As that money ran out and the services and supports continued, we began deficit spending last year, with the deficit growing to $154 million this year, and the deficit declining declining significantly next year and slightly the year after. Which brings us back to ending fund balance. And here the blue line is the number at second interim, with that orange line being at first interim. And you do see a significant change, and it's not for the better. based on that review where we saw a lot of those services are necessarily under our control, and also taking into account other factors related to LCFF. The numbers are definitely worse than they were at first interim. So we're projecting to be down to $97.9 million by the end of 26-27. But once again, not all of that is unrestricted. So if you look at just the end of this year, the unrestricted fund balance accounts for only 27%, whereas, and then once again moving around clockwise, ELOP funds 18%. There's only 2 block grants left. So all of the COVID relief grant funds, with the exception of these 2 block grants, have been expended. All we have left right now is the arts, music, and instructional materials block grant, and the learning recovery block grant, and then the other restricted funds in purple, 30%, and are unspendable at 10%. So what are the next steps? Looking back, we spent the last 2 meetings going into detail about all of the efforts related to reducing the deficit. So looking forward, we're gonna revisit those. So short term, this month and next month, budget subcommittees are going to be formed, and they've already started to be formed, and they will begin to meet. And I'll go over what those subcommittees are in the next slide. We are going to finalize the core resolution, which this board also approved back in December, to give us additional flexibility on our categorical restricted funding and a constant and continued review of supply services and capital expenditures. Those subcommittees that I just mentioned, there's 4 of them. One of them is going to be facilities, to really take a look at what we could do with our facilities in order to optimize utilization and improve our budget and impact the budget deficit. We're going to be looking at both enrollment and ADA. So enrollment as well as attendance factor. There'll be another committee for operational efficiency, which is going to be a broad scope, and then a site funding task force to really look at how we can manage site budgets and do so equitably and in a way that helps our budget situation. Looking at medium-term and long-term solutions, in May and June, we'll actually implement the core resolution and the fiscal stabilization plan as part of the 25-26 budget. We're going to have continued review of utilities and waste management, as well as all of supply services and capital. And then long-term, as I mentioned at first interim, consideration of solar improvements for general fund savings and continued review of supplies and services. Now, what this looks like, what the deficit reduction looks like, and I'm going to spend some time on these next few slides. If we're looking at the overall general fund, both unrestricted and restricted, this slide shows all of the things that we're doing to erase that budget deficit. But let me define the budget deficit. So I mentioned earlier that we've got deficit spending in the current year of $154 million. So that's the structural deficit. And if we extrapolate that out to the next 2 years, the deficit that we need to reduce in 25-26 and 26-27 is that $154 million times 2. So we need to find, over the course of those 2 years, $308 million in savings, whether it be revenue enhancement or reductions in expenditures. So looking at that, and this is just a blow up of that same slide, so the numbers are easier to read. So starting in the upper right hand corner, the reduction in force, the layoffs, account for 21%. And I don't want to say only 21%, because we know that these are actual people with families and it has an impact. So we understand that. The reality, though, is this district is looking hard at all possible solutions, and because of that, the reduction in force accounts for just 21% of everything that we're doing to tackle the budget deficit. The SERP accounts for 16%. LCFF revenue enhancement is 11%. And if you recall from the previous presentation, just incremental increases in attendance factor or UPP can grow this. So that is where a big part of our effort is going to continue to be. Supplies and services, even though we dialed back on some of those assumptions to make them, more realistic, that still accounts for 27% of the reductions. Capital projects and expenditures, 16%. Unfortunately, we still have not identified $26 million in savings. So we still need to close that gap, which is about 9%. So that's looking at unrestricted and restricted together. But that's really not the whole picture. You've heard me talk about the importance of focusing on unrestricted. We've talked about the core resolution. So what we did is we also looked at tackling the structural deficit of unrestricted only. And the way this works is we've identified the current year structural deficit on the unrestricted side of $115 million. Multiply that by 2, $230 million. So we need to find in 25, 26, and 26, 27, we need to identify $230 million in either revenue enhancement or expenditure reductions. As part of our assumptions, in looking at the breakdown between salaries, between unrestricted and restricted, the assumption here is that 64% of the salaries are in unrestricted, and pretty much all of the expenditures are like that. So in looking at the numbers on this particular slide, this is once again just unrestricted. The reduction in force under 20%, 19%, SERP 15%, the revenue enhancement 15%, supplies and services 23, capital projects 13, and that core resolution that we talked about 8%. So $18 million worth of savings on the core resolution, which still leaves us with 7% on the structural deficit. And this is where those committees that I mentioned come into play. And I want to talk about those committees in the context of that slide as well as the current slide. So looking at that trend down in 26, 27 to just over $20 million, that is just 2%, just over our 2% required reserves. If you follow that slope into 27, 28, that potentially is a very scary number. That is why these committees are so important. We need to get this under control. We need to tackle everything from site funding to operational efficiency to revenue enhancement related to enrollment retention and ADA. We need to get that under control because otherwise, when we get to adopted budget in June, if we don't get it under control, those numbers are going to be very sobering. So we really don't have a choice. We need to get this under control, and those committees are going to do everything possible to do that. Moving forward, I mentioned earlier that we're going to be bringing to this board next month the updated core resolution as well as an update on fiscal stabilization. And we are going to continue budget discussions with all of our partners, including next week meetings with our labor partners and 2 different town halls, as Superintendent Almendarez talked about in his comments at the beginning of the meeting, both an in-person town hall and an online webinar. And I will take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hacker. If any of my colleagues have questions, please add yourself to the speakers list. We'll start with Dr. Alvarez.
Okay, let's start for reals. I have a couple of questions. What does it cost to run our school district for 1 week?
So if we're looking at overall expenditures,
Right.
just got to do some quick math in my head. About $16 million.
About $16 million. And the legal reserve that we can maintain is, what's the maximum amount? The amount?
About $18 million.
17, 18. So the reserve that we're legally required to have is $17 million, and it costs us $16 million a week to run our school district.
That's correct. Yeah. And it's important to point out that if we get that low And I did see, we did as part of second interim a 3-year cash flow. And did I answer all your questions before I go into this next part? Okay. So we did a 3-year cash flow. And so cash flow is not just where we're at the end of the year. It's where we're at in terms of bank balance at the end of every single month between now and at the end of the third year. And not surprisingly, as we get really close to minimum required reserves, our fund balance in the middle of that last year, 26, 27, dipped so low that I have no doubt that we would have to go out for what's called a tax revenue anticipation note, which is a short-term loan in order to make sure that we can meet all of our obligations. So it's that 2% minimum required reserves truly is minimum. It is not advisable to get down that low, because with that low cash flow, sometimes, and I compare it to a newly married couple who's having to make a decision as to which bill to pay each month as you're starting out your life. I've been in districts when I took over as CBO at a prior district. We were in that position where we were literally deciding what bills to pay, and we actually had vendors coming into the building, into the lobby, threatening violence if they didn't get paid. So it's really important to manage cash flow.
On slide 27, we have unrestricted and restricted funds.
Yes.
Actually, 27.
I think that's slide 27.
Well, actually, the ending fund balance one with the graphs.
That one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Except that my computer is blue and red.
Okay.
So you stated that the majority of our wages and salaries and benefits come from unrestricted funds?
Correct. About 65% of salaries and benefits come from unrestricted.
And what types of salaries would fall under restricted funds?
So there's some flexibility there, which is the point of the core resolution. But so because special education is funded, I'm not going to even say primarily, but because a lot of special education funding is federal in nature, is restricted. All of special education is found in restricted. And then what we do is, because the restricted funds are not sufficient to meet that, the general fund makes a contribution. The unrestricted general fund makes a contribution to the restricted general fund. So the short answer is, what you're going to see in terms of salaries in restricted would be special education. You would also see maintenance, because that's a lot of the salaries are paid for out of routine restricted maintenance, as well as some salaries that we've identified to be paid for out of grants. So some of the instructional salaries that where we brought on additional people during COVID, we paid for them with ESSER, with Learning Recovery Block Grant. That's where you're going to find those salaries.
So as we look at our restricted and unrestricted funds, if we're going to make any cuts, it would primarily have to come from unrestricted funds?
That's correct.
All right. And actually, if we could go over to slide number 23. No, actually, hold on.
Title deficit reductions. It's the first of the circle graphs. Pie graphs.
Yeah, the pie chart.
Yeah, there you go. Circle graph.
Actually, on that one, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because somebody had mentioned that all the cuts that we're doing is specifically through the RIFs. And the thing is that we've done other things to reduce our deficit. The SERP saves us $34 million. LCFF revenue enhancements, $34 million. Services and supplies, $53 million, which is 23%, and capital expenditures, 13%, which is $30,792,000. The question that I had was regarding the LCFF revenue enhancements. What contingency plans do we have if those revenue enhancements don't come through?
There is no contingency. I mean, we there's no room for failure here. We have to do whatever it takes, and it's not even financial reasons. If we need to manage attendance, because if students aren't attending, they're not learning. So this is one of those areas where, and for the most part, I get along with educational services, but this is definitely one of those areas where we really get along, because driving attendance drives revenue. So it's really there is no contingency. If we can't increase revenue, it is going to be very challenging come adopted budget to deliver a budget that puts us in a position to remain positive.
So on this
Can
chart,
I add something to that too? So, we're doing everything we can do to try and get the kids to come to school. Then we have layered on top of that the national immigration policies, which are instilling fear in a lot of our families that are keeping them out of school because of that. And then, obviously, as you've seen here tonight, the labor issues that we're having and the conversations that are having at the school sites with the parents. I mean, it's just a real challenging time for us, and in some cases, we almost feel like we're shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to solve a problem. We're actually creating more of an issue, and it's the frustration that we're trying to navigate, not knowing what's coming down from Washington D.C. or what issues we're going to be faced with locally.
Yeah. We just have to focus on our circle of influence. I mean, there are a lot of things out of our control. We need just to put our nose to the grindstone and focus on everything that we can positively impact.
the other question that I had is supplies and services. So we already took a cut out of that. I mean, how much more can we cut out of supplies and services? Because I mean, I'm just thinking textbook adoption by itself. Last time we did one, it was $7 million for textbook adoption. With inflation and with time passing, I imagine that the cost has gone up a lot more. So realistically, how much more can we cut from supplies and services?
Yeah. I at this point, I don't see a whole lot of room for additional cuts. That was part of the second interim analysis, really taking a look at what's controllable and what's not controllable, and we believe we identified as much as possible that's under our control. Even so, those cuts are going to be painful. I mean, especially on the capital side, stopping construction projects for 2.5 years or two and a quarter years, that could be painful. So, but that gives us a little bit of runway. By doing everything possible over the next 2 years, that gives us runway to get enrollment under control, to get attendance under control, UPP under control.
I'm going to go ahead and let somebody else go, and I'll come back next pass.
Thank you. A level of questions. Ms. Magdaleno?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And thank you to the speakers that came in earlier. They had great questions as well. So some of my questions are more directed for clarifications. And one of them that stood out to me is, can you please, you're in the perfect slide. Can you please explain, are we or are we not in a deficit? Because I heard someone say we are not.
Yes, we're absolutely in a deficit. Okay, and here, let me just. So I'll start with this slide. So this does not show the ending fund balance, but this is what demonstrates the deficit. So the green line is revenue, the purple line is expenditures. It is very simple math. If we are booking more revenue in a fiscal year than expenditures, we are in a surplus. If we are booking more expenditures than revenue, we are in a deficit. These numbers are from unaudited actuals, and when I say unaudited actuals, that doesn't mean it's not audited, it's inaccurate. These are accurate numbers. But that unaudited actuals is the final report of the year that has our finances. These are real numbers. They're black and white. They're in our financials over the last few years. You can see prior to the pandemic, we were pretty much even. So in 17, 18, we were pretty much even. We then had a slight surplus and then a slight deficit right before the pandemic. Okay, and I was a CBO in another district at the time, and I remember what was going through all of our minds. And this was prior to the pandemic. We were looking at the potential of a recession, and we were all talking about the perfect storm, and California was suffering, and the whole country was suffering, but California was really suffering. So we were expecting to have to do massive layoffs. The same thing was happening in Santa Ana. I just was in a different county at the time. And all of a sudden, the pandemic hit, and the federal and state government threw $400 million at this district. And at the same time, and you've heard me talk about this before, at the same time, they also did incentives to local businesses. They did incentives to individual taxpayers. What that did is it staved off the recession. It was an artificial end to all of the economic drivers that were going to cause us to go into a recession. Those factors stayed in place through the pandemic, hidden, but they stayed in place. So now our money has run out. The money for individual taxpayers has run out. The money that was provided to businesses, and I forgot to mention municipalities, all of that has run out. So now we're back to where we were before the pandemic, and all of the factors that were going to create a recession are in place, with additional ones now in place related to some pretty wild fluctuations in the stock market over the past few days. So, long answer to your question. During the pandemic, the green line was above the purple line. We were in a surplus because of that $400 million. But that was all one-time money. And starting last year, the services that we were providing during the pandemic continued, but the money stopped flowing. So we went into a deficit last year, a bigger deficit this year because the money really stopped flowing. I told you that ESSER 3, all of the ESSERs are exhausted. And with the deficit reduction plan that we have in place for the next few years, we still have a deficit, but it's getting smaller and smaller as we try to get that under control. We are absolutely in a deficit. We are using reserves to continue to provide supports.
Thank you for the clarification. And speaking of reserves, how much will we have in reserves by the end of the fiscal year?
So,
And let me add to that really quick. And why can't we use it to pay our educators?
Well, it's $208 million, and we are using it because what we're doing is we're continuing to use those reserves to continue to pay for expenditures in the next 2 years. We're going to continue to be in a deficit, so that $208 million will decrease next year to 147, and the year after to 97. And remember, that is unrestricted and restricted. And if we're looking at just unrestricted, by the time we get to that last year, minimum required reserves.
Okay.
So we are using reserves to pay for educators.
Okay, and one of my last questions for clarifications again. Superintendent Almendarez, announced that he is retiring, and for clarification, will he be getting retroactive pay or a pay raise?
He will not.
Has he ever gotten a 5% pay raise within, recently?
He has not.
Okay, thank you. And just for clarification for the public, Superintendent Almendarez did not get the 5% raise. It was pulled, I believe, in December. Was that the?
That's correct.
3%? Thank you for the clarification. He did not get the 3, he did not get a 5, he did not get a raise. For clarification.
And no bonus either.
And no bonus. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Brazier Aceves?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the questions to my colleagues for the questions. So I have a few. Let me let me see where I'm starting off. So, okay, could you please go to slide 2021? So for the next steps, I know that a lot of our community members and staff have been asked this evening and have been asking, what is the plan? And so I wanted to specifically ask, because another thing that I'm hearing from the community is an ask to us as the board is, looking like for more information on what we've done to look at whether or not we're management heavy. So I'm looking at the operational, I might be on the wrong, let's see. Thank you. Operational efficiency subcommittee. Ron, can you share with us, is this a space, is this a subcommittee that can, really tackle that question so that our community members can feel like there's that, because I think we have those conversations and I'm hearing from the community that they want, and I know there's been budget town halls and these things, right? But if our folks are still asking for transparency and they want to understand better or hear more about the analysis of whether or not we're management heavy, is that something that this group can, look at as a community, as a committee that's put together with all of our different partners?
Absolutely. So if we're looking at the site funding task force, that's looking for, making sure that we have proper formulas for staffing and proper formulas for all of the expenditures related to running a site. The operational efficiency looks at the district as a whole, looks at the departments, and part of that scope that committee will be tasked with is absolutely looking at management ratios.
Thank you. And so for the site funding, I'll come back to that one, but for the site funding task force, we're also hearing questions, valid questions about, well, we are looking at academic achievement, which we talked about, and as we had reviewed our data a few weeks ago, and I actually really, appreciate the community's question about, well, how are we going to tackle those goals, continue that work with this? Is that something that the site funding task force can be looking at and giving us feedback as a board? How can we make sure that we are still using our resources, whatever resources are coming down the line in the future, whether that's, hopefully more one-time funding and things like that, to do whatever we can to pull our resources to the sites?
That's a great question. The short answer is yes. The longer answer, and I heard the speakers, and I understand that there's confusion around the reduction in force, and it is a little bit confusing when a certain number of counselors receive notices. But there's a reason that many counselors receive notice. That doesn't necessarily mean we're reducing all those counselors. There's all sorts of things at play related to bumping and all that. So we heard talk tonight of there not being counselors at sites. That's absolutely not true. There will be a counselor at every single elementary school. There will be supports in place at every school. We have to go through this complicated reduction in force process, which is set in statute, and it is confusing to navigate, but we could definitely make the commitment that those supports are going to be in place at sites.
And going off of that question, can you go to one of the last slides? Let's see, where it shows the timeline with maybe 28. Okay, so as a district, can you share why, let me see my question. So, because I'm looking at, how the state law requires us to put out information regarding the RIFs to staff by March 15th, yet we don't know the state budget until May, And if you go to slide, which is on that slide, right? But if you go to slide 5, I believe it shows the percentage, right, of our funding. Sorry, not 5. Percentage of our funding that comes from the state. There's a pie chart somewhere.
Yeah, and I'll stay on this slide, and
Okay.
I'll remind everyone, you're talking about the LCF. So 71% of our funding is from LCFF. So the vast majority is funding that is identified first in the governor's proposed budget in January and then solidified in the May revise. And you're absolutely right to point out that something's backwards here, because we are having to make staffing decisions in March without knowing what the budget is going to be, and we won't know that until May. Is that your point?
That was my point. And then I also wanted to ask, can you share with us and for the community these numbers? And you mentioned that the numbers of folks that are getting these notices, right, it sometimes is looking higher than what ultimately the process lands at. So can you clarify if those, even the 280, right? Not is that set in stone at this point?
So two answers to that. So the 280 is not set in stone. If things happen between now and May, where somehow additional revenue is identified, that is not set in stone. And then the other part of that is, it's 380? 380 notices went out, but only 280 positions at the most will be reduced. So 100 of those notices will be rescinded as soon as we get through the statutory process. And Jennifer can answer these questions much more fluently
and I want
than
to
I
add
can.
to that, if I may. We're going through the legal process right now, and the employees have a right to their due process through the laws that exist for districts to navigate these layoff notices. So when employees get their notifications prior to March 15th, that is part of the legal requirement that the district is supposed to be doing, in addition to giving them their due process by holding a hearing. So we're just simply following the law like many other districts across the state, and that HR has put together a web page for employees to the employee portal to go to for more information, more specific information. So when, and I get it, people are frustrated and they're confused, but this is a legal requirement that not just Santa Ana Unified School District has to go through, every district in California has to go through this process, and she'll explain the rifts.
Yeah. So yes, we're looking at approximately 280 employees at the end of this process. The layoff notices have to go out to anybody that potentially may be laid off through the displacement process. So an example is our counselors. If we had, say, 300 or 30 counselors that needed to be reduced that were at 202, which is our high school, and they were reduced down to 192, that could potentially reassign counselors down to 182. So that's 30 going down, so they have to be notified of a layoff, and then 30 at the 192 that they may bump out. And so that's a total of 60 notifications when we know that there will be 30 that are actually laid off.
Can you explain the 192? I think
I'm sorry.
You threw a lot of
yes.
numbers, and I think
Yeah, that
just
was.
to clarify
So the
all of that.
202 work year is for our high school counselors, and so that's what their assignment is. And then
Those are work days.
work days, yes. And then the 192 calendar work days is for our counselors at the intermediate and elementary level.
And then I did hear, it may have been during our last meeting, but I did hear, someone ask or suggest that we have the option to wait until the fall. Can you explain to us, like, what either the March 15th deadline or wait till the fall to make these decisions? And can you explore that with us? Because I know that we also heard folks asking at the last meeting for a hold on the process, right, and more time. But can you please explain or share what would that entail, like fiscally, education-wise? Like, is that considered best practice or a responsible move? If
I'm going to ask Ron to address that one because he had a slide up there that showed if we were to delay the layoffs this year, what impact that would have on the budget outgoing years.
Right, and I don't have that slide today. That was a slide from a previous presentation.
But not regarding the budget, because I think I did ask that question at the last meeting. Sorry to interrupt, but specifically, and I'm asking this because this, was something that I was looking into, right? And I was something that I was learning that is actually technically an option for school districts to do layoffs in the fall. We always hear of the March 15th deadline. So I'm just wondering, trying to understand, as we're looking at our options, what is your analysis on that?
Yeah. So there isn't an option. So as the superintendent explained, we have to provide March 15th notices, which then says to the employee that they may not be employed for the following year. If we wait for the fall, it's too late to be able to do that. We have to wait for the next year's March 15th to be able to notify them for the following year. So this notification goes out, has to be done by March 15th, and then that allows us to then go through the rest of the process with the ALJ hearing and the appeals, and then the final resolution that we'll bring back to the board.
So it's not, under state law, we cannot
Notify people beyond
wait
March 15th.
until the fall. We cannot make changes in the fall.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
So this, for certificated employees, classified employees are different.
Well, classified actually are the same now.
Oh.
So yeah, March 15th also.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying, because I was, as folks have been reaching out, that was one of the, I did hear it at a board meeting, and I did hear it in an individual conversation. So I wanted to know that. I wasn't aware. So thank you.
May I also add that in the event that our enrollment does go up in the fall, we will be able to rescind positions back. And so that is maybe something that was part of the question of what will happen. And our employees get to go on to a 39-month rehire list. So as soon as we have a position that opens up, whether it be in June or August or September or throughout the year, we call them first by the order of seniority.
Thank you, Ms. Brazier-Seves. We can come back if you have more questions. Dr. Alvarez?
I wanted to go back real quick to the fiscal stabilization plan. I think we approved that in January.
You saw it first in November.
In November?
And then you approved it in December.
We approved the fiscal stabilization plan in December, and basically that plan tasked the superintendent to develop some sort of plan to get us back on track in regards to our finances. And from what I remember from that resolution, or the way that I interpreted it, is that it wasn't a one-time plan, but it was a living plan in the sense that we're tasked with constantly looking at what our different options are. And so going back to the fiscal stabilization plan, so the plan, is a fiscal stabilization plan or resolution, is that required by the state or the county?
So the short answer is it's required by the county. It was not required to be done at first interim. It would have been required to be done by second interim. What we wanted to do in order to be as transparent as possible with our communication to our employees and the communication to the County Office of Education, we started early. So we did that in December so that we were being very transparent about everything that we were planning to do to tackle the structural deficit, including reduction in force, SERP, and then cuts in supplies, services, and capital, as well as revenue enhancement.
So the fiscal stabilization plan was required by the county. Under what conditions would they ask for it?
They're going to ask for it for any district that is in deficit spending. So any district that's in deficit spending, they're going to require at some point a fiscal stabilization plan or a deficit reduction plan. They call it different things in order to really lay out in real terms what the district is planning to do to address the structural deficit.
And there was a meeting, I think, in November, December from the Department of Education towards where they specifically talked about our budget and they talked about our fiscal stabilization plan. And from what I remember, based on the comments of the person in charge of finance over there, the County of Orange was satisfied with our fiscal stabilization plan.
That's correct. And this is, I mean, this communication wasn't just the fiscal stabilization plan. This district stays in close contact with Orange County Department of Education. I stay in close contact with their chief financial officer so that they understand that we're serious about addressing the structural deficit. If we had not approved that fiscal stabilization plan in December, there was a very real chance that they would have not certified our first interim report as positive. They would not have affirmed our positive certification, because we would not have, without that, we would not have spelled out everything that we're planning to do to reduce the deficit.
And in regards to the stabilization plan, how will the fiscal stabilization plan ensure the district avoids similar structural deficits in the future? And I don't know if there is any type of answer because there's too many uncertainties. The May we get the revised budget from the governor. We're still waiting to see what happens with the Department of Ed, and we're still waiting for other funding sources. Any backup plan?
No, there's no plan other than to focus on everything that is within our control. I mean, that is all everything that is under our control, which are discretionary expenditures, revenue enhancement related to increased attendance factor or increased unduplicated pupil percentage. Everything that is under our control, we need to focus on, and if other things happen, we're going to have to adjust.
And we've been relying on the data from Davis Demographics in regards to our projections. And I think our projections have been off for the last couple of years because I think they were projecting 1,500 a year. And I think we're higher, a little bit significantly higher than that.
So Davis has actually been fairly accurate in almost all grade levels over the last couple of years, with the exception of TK. It is the projection going to next year that has me scratching my head. We've had multiple conversations with Davis. They're standing by their numbers. At the end of the day, we need to make an informed decision based on what they're projecting, based on cohort projection analysis, based on historical trend analysis, and we will do that as part of the adopted budget process.
And based on their projections, have they given any indication of when they think we're going to level off in regards to declining enrollment?
There's no level off anticipated. The birth rates continue to decline. Economic pressures within Santa Ana continue to prevail. So there's no end in sight with regard to declining enrollment.
I was going to ask another question. So declining enrollment is hitting us. Do we have any data indicating towards where those students are going, where those families are going? I think last time okay.
I can speak in high level to that. I almost don't want to because I don't want to give anybody else any other ideas. But I actually have been meeting with every family that has asked to not continue here in Santa Ana. And I'm putting together the data around why they're making those decisions and where they're going. Actually, a large number of them are going to a district near us, but not actually that close to us. Most of what I have been encountering is Fountain Valley, actually, which was very surprising to me. So I was asking about what's drawing them there. So I'm going through all these questions with them, really trying to capture the data around what we need to be doing. I will tell you it's been very fruitful having the conversations with the families. And I think that relationship building, honestly, I know a couple that I've spoke to, I told them, I said, when you're not happy over there, give us a call, please reach out to me, and we will, provide that customer service and really make sure that you're taken care of. Because I don't know another district that offers all the programming that we do, and you guys talk about it all the time. So I think people are going to go other places and not find what they're looking for.
And I just had one last comment. Research shows that community schools have been shown to be effective in reducing declining enrollment. And that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Alvarez. Ms. Lepsak?
Yeah, I know we've been hearing a lot about attrition and, what can we do so it's not just ripping the Band-Aid off with 280, layoffs, rather do it gradually, 100, or whatever it takes. And I know, we've heard a lot about thinking outside the box. I know we've been talking about this, but I just want to put it out there again. Okay, one more time here. So if we're already making cutbacks from the top, we're doing that
Yes, we are.
presently.
Yes.
And we gave 3% raises to management and to certificated. I don't think we did classified yet. Classified also?
Yes.
So everybody got 3% raise, the whole district. And if that raise were to be removed, stop that raise, did some furlough days, is there a way, settle with OSHA and instead of keep these attorney fees going, make it a win-win for our community and get, I don't know, I'm throwing it out there, $5 million and stop the attorney fee bleed. I'm just trying to think, how can we make this a win-win where we could actually do an attrition plan? Is it possible? Can we do it?
The short answer is even if we were to settle tomorrow with OSHA for the full amount, and even if we were to, and we wouldn't be able to without collective bargaining, even if we were to roll back all of the salary increases, we still would not be able to solve the budget deficit without the reduction in force.
Without the full 280.
It could be less than 280, but there is no way to tackle this without looking at that part of the budget which represents 81% of expenditures, salaries and benefits.
The reality of the situation is we are way overstaffed. That's the bottom line. We just have more staff than we have the ability to serve the students. So this is what we're trying to do, is to operate within our means, within the revenue that we're generating. Our concern is, with all of this stuff happening around us, the revenue potentially could decline even more, which means in the outgoing years, if we don't address this problem, it could be even more layoffs. And we have to address this structural deficit. We have to right size our staff at all levels, including management. Until we do that, we will not solve this problem.
I concur.
All right. Anything else? Oh, okay. Ms. Brazier Sevis?
Thank you. Again, I wanted to circle back to the top heavy, right? The management heavy. And thank you, Superintendent Almendarez, for sharing that with the community, or sharing that with us, that, we will be looking at all of those, continue to look at management as well, right? But can you share with us, because the community is calling for this, has there been an analysis of whether or not the district is top heavy? And if so, has that been presented to the public?
The analysis has been done. It's not been presented to the public. And this is something that has actually been shared with our labor partners in those. Superintendent Almendarez has talked about all of the work we've done to communicate with our labor partners. So school services has facilitated those sessions for the last 2.5 years. And in one of those early sessions, one of those sessions where I had just started with the district, I do recall discussions about basically management ratios, talking about management to student ratios and teacher to student ratios. And the data clearly showed then and shows even now that this district is not top heavy. And I mean, that doesn't mean that we're not looking at management. We are absolutely looking at management. You've heard us talk about the reductions that have taken place at the highest levels in cabinet. So the cabinet level reductions over the past few years. We're absolutely looking at management. Um, have we communicated all of that with the public? No, and that is something that we can do in future town halls.
Okay, yeah, I think it would be very helpful for transparency for folks to see that, especially if, the work has been done. And I think sometimes there's conversations that are had, but maybe it's, just making sure that it's getting out to the majority of folks would be great. And then actually, maybe Jennifer, can you explain, per the community's inquiry tonight, we heard a lot about why it is that some of our most highly revered educators and those who, volunteer their time and have really built and run extraordinary programs in our schools have received layoff notices. In this process, can you speak to that? Because I think folks are, really asking for accountability. Like, why are we doing this? And do we have options? And can you explain that to us?
So we don't have options. So per ed code, with the layoff process, it has to be by seniority. And it has to be by seniority within the particular kinds of service or any service area.
And is there anything that we could have done to make the case of, but this program or these staff, I know ALA came, staff and shared that they're a newer site, and so they feel like they're going to be disproportionately impacted. Would the labor review process make exceptions for that, or is there anything that we could do?
No, we would be violating the rights of the employees if we did not go through seniority. The only time that we would deviate from that is if we had a skip, which we do for IB at the high school level, and that has to be stated in our resolution as it was. But that's the only program that we actually did a skip for.
And can you explain a little bit of the thought that went into this, like, why not put a skip for all of the various programs?
Sure.
What would be the impact?
Sure. We did start looking at probably about 5 different programs, including dual, to see what that analysis would look like. If we just did another skip, say with dual, we would have been actually cutting down to and laying off our employees that have been here all the way down to 2001. So what that would have resulted in is laying off employees that have been here for 24 years, and then with a skip having employees stay here that maybe only have 5 years of experience. So there's an inequity with that, and so that was the decision of the district not to do any more skips. That was necessary, and IB was necessary at the high school level because we put so much money into training our IB teachers, and so we do have to have those IB trained teachers for the program.
And can you just lastly speak to that a little bit more? Because I did hear folks say, like, I have that specialty, I have that passion, because those are things that I know that we had to discuss, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that, like, what is the standard for, the labor review process of identifying a skip? Like, there may be some training, but can that qualify? Can we?
So what we would look at for a skip is the competence and the training that's involved with that. So if somebody is teaching, and if we're looking at individual people who have different talents, then that would not be appropriate. We wouldn't be able to do that skip. So anybody that can teach a program, for example, AVID would be a program that we have trained people to do AVID, but we can also train those people to come in and do AVID. So they don't have to have a certain certificate, such as IB.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I'll just wrap up with a few final questions. Mr. Hacker, I know that you've identified slide 24 on mine. It's the first pie chart on your the one that has to do with
The one with
deficit
unrestricted and
reductions.
restricted?
Yeah. Both unrestricted and restricted. I see that you have a remaining balance of about $26 million just in gray there. And so I'm wondering when we're going to get some more clarity around what we're going to do to close that gap with those $26 million. Because what I don't want to be doing is keep moving down the road and those $26 million are just still sitting there and we haven't figured something out. And so I want to hear about the plan to address that.
And that is where those subcommittees come into play. So when we present in April, it will be the finalized core resolution, and it will be an update on the deficit reduction with a new chart that identifies closing everything.
Okay. And then can you talk, in terms of the budget subcommittees, can you talk a little bit about like who's going to be involved in those subcommittees? I guess just start there, please, for me.
So first of all, in terms of getting community input, at the town halls next week and at our meetings with our labor partners, and then we're going to follow up with meetings with students, we're going to identify what all of those partners' priorities are. And that is going to inform our core, our finalized core resolution. And then that information is going to then be used by all of the subcommittees, which will be comprised of our labor partners and people from departments across the district. So within business services, site level people, other district office level people. So it'll be a cross section of experts that could really get into the weeds, that requires technical knowledge of how the district works, so that we can scrub budget reports and do analysis of services. So analysis of software, analysis of consultants, analysis of utilities. So really getting into the weeds and doing the analysis.
Okay, thank you. So I think that first piece is the most important to me and the most critical piece, and making sure that there's community input at the very beginning, at the very start, and that, again, like you said, is going to inform the work of the subcommittees.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And then the last question that I had, I know that this is not an easy process. I know that it's, there's many layers. It can be very confusing. It's, as a board member, it's still something that I'm understanding just right alongside all of you who are being impacted by this. But for those individuals who do have questions or who have uncertainties, who can those individuals go to for answers?
So, are you talking about the layoff process?
Yes, sorry.
So, if those individuals are not able to find, excuse me, if those individuals are not able to find answers from their union, then those individuals can contact the HR department. And all of the people that were affected were sent by email a link to a website that has lots of information, lots of resources related to every aspect of the layoff. So once again, if they're not able to find answers from their unions, we're here to provide those answers.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you so much.